United States, UK, etc. This field as an academic field, right, as something that people in universities study and teach about, started with a man called Laswell. Laswell wrote a book called The Policy Sciences in 1951, where he kind of defined this field of study, which could be taught in universities, not just a practical thing that happens inside government, but let's say a discipline. And he said that policy sciences were specific compared to general political science in three ways. The first one was that it is problem oriented. Policy analysis tries to analyze a specific policy, right? It is not aimed at understanding politics in general. The objective of policy analysis is to give advice on a particular policy, not to, from here, derive the general laws of how citizens and politicians interact. It is not fundamental science, right? Even within the sphere of political science, it does not try to teach us about politics. It tries to teach us about whatever specific problem we are talking with, which could be a political problem, right? Which could be a societal problem, and it involves some kind of general theory about society, but still it is focused on something in particular. It is an applied science in that sense. And it also only deals with problems. It doesn't deal with how good the state is or things like that, right? It is not about writing an ode to the Constitution or something. It only deals with problematic issues and how we can resolve them. So in that sense, this theory, right, which deals both with very broad general ideological questions such as who are the people or who deserves power. No, it is more focused. Second thing in which policy analysis is specific is that policy analysis is not just political science. It is focused at problems, fields, and not at disciplines. In general, usually it incorporates some kind of political science and some kind of economy. These are, like, say, the two main fields that policy analysis would draw from, because it involves usually some kind of budgeting and calculation. It usually involves also some insight in institutions. But then it also draws from sociology a lot, because a lot of problems that politics deal with are sociological problems, right? Not all of them. You have questions of if we should go to space or not, and what kind of rocket we should use. That is not a very sociological problem. Problems from traffic to poverty to pollution itself have a sociological side to them. Like me, often take part in policy analysis, like me. And lastly, it also involves all kinds of applied sciences, right? Because policy problems are about particular things. Let's say you have a problem about pollution. Of course, it is relevant to the legal side of it. Of course, it's relevant to the cost of it. Of course, it's relevant what the people around that side of pollution think. But also the chemical side of the pollution itself is relevant, right? So in order to do good policy analysis, if you don't deal with purely social economical problems, you usually need to draw on applied sciences too, right? If you deal with, for example, the side to it, but that's also just calculating how much pressure different dams would have and how much energy that would generate. So policy analysis often, let's say, borrows experts from other fields that are not normally concerned with. So it is multidisciplinary. If you have a team, of course, right? Otherwise, you have to do all of this yourself. And lastly, it is more value-oriented. Value-oriented to some extent. But what is different is that political science explicitly tries to make things better, right? It's not experimenting with different policy options just to see what would happen, because maybe we learn something about society. No, it is trying to make society better, trying to make politics better from its own value perspective, of course, right? Because what better means, that itself is a choice. It could be more efficient, it could be cheaper. You could have less government as your objective, right? You could have more government. So it needs to engage with values, even if it's very technocratic, or even if it wants to pretend to be technocratic. It's still, at the minimum, it believes in politics, right? That it has a positive valuation towards politics. There's no such thing as anarchistic policy advice. Maybe it exists, but it would be a joke. Because you believe that the government can solve the problem. Otherwise, there's no point in talking about it, right? So in that sense, it is value laden. So that is the outskirts of this field. Now, next question is, who's in this field, right? Let's talk about these weird creatures called policy analysts. Filthy people, I've heard. So policy analysts are some type of researcher. They're different from other researchers and other scientists in a few ways. They're kind of weird. They're the ugly duckling in the pond of research. Now, what makes these despicable creatures like me so weird? First of all, and this is not going to sound too weird to you as a citizen, but for a researcher, it's kind of weird, is that they strive towards social relevance. Policy scientists do not want to talk about things that don't matter, or that don't matter on the short term. Their deepest nightmare is to write something and then nothing happening, right? That just be having been useless. Other scientists are not so much bothered with this. Mathematicians, for example, rarely wonder about what the point of this even is, right? They just find it exciting to figure out how numbers work. The same with astrophysics. These people usually don't pause very long to think about why they're doing this in the first place. They just find it interesting to do it. With policy analysis, this is different. You do it because you want to contribute to better policies. You want to be relevant. You're also not studying things that happened 300 years ago, right? A book like The Rhetoric of Reaction, which some of you have read with me. This is not policy analysis. This deals with policy. It's political science, yes, but it's about things that long ago have happened. Policy analysis is about relevant things right now. Second, hi Sophia, nice to see that one of you is alive. It is normative, right? Most scientists will, and they're lying, but they will say that they are objective and that they don't necessarily want to talk about the application of their results. So they'll just say, this is the data, right? Deal with it. Apparently there's a rise in suicides with young people. Somebody should do something, right? If you ask them what should be done, they say, oh, I'm just a scientist, I don't know, right? I just state the facts. Policy scientists cannot hide behind this because they have to make policy, right? You can't say, well, our conclusion is that the problem is real. And then the prime minister says, you should figure it out, right? That's not how it works. So they have to be prescriptive. They have to, in a general way, suggest a course of action, right? That doesn't mean they have to be super biased or argue for a certain interest group or something, although they can. It's just prescriptive in the sense that it must suggest something, right? And that's something that most scientists are kind of scared of. They don't want to, they want to draw a very clear line between stating the facts and political decisions. Well, a policy analyst cannot really do that and doesn't want to do that either. And for that reason, policy analysis is a bit more argumentative than general science. If you would read a psychology paper or a biochemical paper, the only thing they will defend is that they're speaking the truth, right? But it could as well end with, so we did the experiments and turns out we still don't know. That is not how it works in policy analysis. You have to make a case, right? So the style of it is going to be more argumentative. It's going to be more deliberate, and that's in a sense less scientific, right? But that is the sin that comes with this field. Now, who are these creatures and where are they found, these weird policy analysts? Well, most commonly, they're found inside the government. The government has people who go on TV and talk, like AMLO, and then you have people who are like, oh my God, what should we do when he says something, right? He says, we're going to do the gas bienestar. And then you have like 400 people who suddenly in panic start running around and figuring out like, what is this plan? And what should we do? Those are the policy analysts. They are the people who are tasked with things. Yeah, so they're professional analysts. They're not always advisors, right? You have the people at Coneval, for example, who don't necessarily say what the government should do. They just collect the data. They're, let's say, lower level policy analysts. But that's where a lot of them are. And they're, of course, in other governments too, of other countries. Writing about us sometimes, like the United States has all kind of strategic policy bureaus that deal with Mexico, for example. So it's not just inside your own country. They also exist outside of this in so-called think tanks, which are private initiatives. Private here in the loose sense, they could belong to a political party too, that do policy analysis. That's their added value, what they do. Either they are for hire, so they just do general policy analysis. These are well, that's quite rare that this happens. This comes close to a consultancy company. I would be suspicious of this anyway. Or you have those who, and this, if, sorry, let me backtrack this. If they're for hire, then they're doing it because somebody wanted it, right? The government contracts them. It's solicited. They're not gonna just waste their time doing analysis without getting paid for it. Or they could work for a certain interest group, like a political party or the tourism sector or something like that, or Coparmex or something like that. And then they will create unsolicited policy analysis. And the government didn't ask for this, maybe would rather have it that you didn't do this analysis, but they're going to do it anyway, right? Because they get paid by some outside group to do it, and then they will deliver that privately or publicly to the government. And then the third location where you find these people are in universities, where again, this can be either solicited or unsolicited. This is going to be much more often individuals rather than teams doing it, right? Inside governments, it can be very big teams. Universities, it's usually people like me that could be solicited, as the government, typically a local government, wants advice on some issue. Or it could be unsolicited, where we just write critical books and come up with plans that we and our students have thought of. So this is where you, as policy analyst, will work, typically in one of those three locations. Or be unemployed and just posting it on Facebook, but that's not as optimal. Now, the field, how did this evolve, right, as a craft? As I said before, advisors have always existed, and you had early on various sociologists who would write policy papers, who would write advice to the government on a certain issue. However, this was still on the outside, right? It really picked up steam when governments decided that they should have their internal policy teams, that they should have a policy analysis as a standard work of government. Before that, it was often just the people in power making decisions, right? They would not have this whole bureaucracy behind them. But since the 50s, most government, including our Mexican government, started incorporating its own research divisions. And that created sufficient demand for universities to create careers in this. And that's where the more general field then comes from, right? We at the faculty, well, you have your career, which is not literally this, but somewhat connected to it, right? But you also have direct careers in public administration that the university offers. Now, how did it evolve? At the beginning, yet this time, like 30s, 40s, 50s, when sociology and economy were very pretentious. and still in the time where they thought things were more simpler than they really were, right? Especially economics, with their ideas that people act in very predictable ways, and you can model them into some kind of simulation where consumers are going to do this, that's going to have this effect, etc. And then if we only would lower the interest rate by 1.2%, the economy would go up, right? This is the more technocratic era, where they saw society basically as an equation, right? As a very giant equation. And if you would only change x3 to x4, then the outcome would be different, right? So policy needed technical expertise, people to mainly calculate things, and then they would give it to the ruler, and the ruler would press these buttons, and then the problem would be fixed. This, even in societies that heavily focused on that, which are not ours, right? Communist societies focus a lot more heavy on policy analysis than capitalist ones, because they plan things ahead. But even that wouldn't always work. Not only because it went wrong. Sometimes things went better than expected, but that also still meant that the analysis was wrong, right? If you overachieve, you're still off chart. So over time, there became a bit less faith in that you could do this. If only because there is no, also one of the reasons there is no central power, usually. Even if there is a central power, that just means that they have the most power, right? They don't mean that they have all power. Or they start noticing that, that politicians don't just listen, or that politicians will not act on a problem because it's the most efficient way, but maybe they take the emotions of the people into account too, right? It would be very efficient to cut off healthcare at 80, because only older people, they just have more costs, so just let them die. That would be a very efficient way of doing it, but that would be electoral suicide for politicians, so they will never listen to such advice, and we should be happy about that. So how did it evolve? Sorry, I got ranting. Forgive me, Miss Mariana, for my distractions. It became over time more qualitative. Policy analysis used to be very close to economics, where they would just use raw data and try to make some kind of model out of it, and then say we should decrease taxes by 2%, and then this is going to happen. It quickly became, well, not quickly, it became clear over time that you cannot just simulate reality. Sometimes you need to also go out there and ask people about stuff. So it became more qualitative over time, more respect for techniques like interviewing, for example, and trying to get knowledge of how things actually work, and knowledge of the problem itself, right? You can just register suicides and then do all kind of calculations on age groups and demographics, or you could ask the parents of people who commit suicide, like what actually happened, and you can get very different knowledge from that than just the numbers. So you got more qualitative models. I was schooled in this second, qualitative policy analysis, although I understand the first two. They're kind of different. It became more organized and oriented towards studying also the linguistic aspects of this. Like not just what is the policy, but how is it sold? What words are we using? What are the concepts here, right? Let's say you have this weekend I had to read a paper, which was terrible, nonetheless, as a reviewer about inequality. And it was about development aid and inequality, and within Europe, like European development policy. And what the Belgian delegation did was they, instead of coming up with some new program, they just focused on redefining inequality. Say, okay, but what is inequality, right? Is it just about that the distribution of money is a certain way, or is it also about power? Is it also about why the distribution of money is like this, etc.? And their policy paper really just talked about how the whole policy is misdirected because they don't understand inequality, right? that is something that you wouldn't get with the just economical approach, right? They would just take for granted what you're trying to do and not really question the words in it. It also became, it had to adapt a bit policy analysis, because policy analysis traditionally was based around this idea of the king, right? The king on his throne, and you need to whisper in his ear and then he's going to do it. Most countries don't have kings anymore, and most countries have a whole lot of different layers of government that need to interact. This is called network governments. You should know that term. Which means that as a policy analyst, you also need to map, how do you say this, the policy itself. Like, you need to know which actors are all involved in it. So if you would, for example, with social policy, with, let's say, labor market, right? This involves both companies, it involves employment agencies, it involves, but it also, for example, involves prisons in some weird way, because ex-convicts then, you know, also get integrated into the labor market. And you need to kind of study the networks between these organizations to be able to make a good intervention. That's called social network analysis. Very complex thing, by the way, that I'll talk about next time. And policy analysis became more attentive towards what we talked about last time, towards participation and you know, what people think about things and taking into account public opinion, and also involving people in it. For example, focus groups that you would use as a method are these. I think I talked about this at the beginning of the month, about these poverty lines that were constructed via focus groups, where you, instead of saying how much something should be, you're just going to ask people, right? Let's say you're making a budget for handicapped people. You're going to ask people, okay, how much, what do they actually need? Okay, need so many apples, so many tortillas. They need 3 kilometers on average per bus, blah, blah, blah. You make that into costs. And so you use people's knowledge and people's judgment to get to your starting positions. Anyway, these are all much detailed things. The point is that it became more complex over time, more broader, and a bit more democratic. Now, what policy analysts actually do, in the sense of what they're trying to do, can greatly differ, right? On the one end of the spectrum, on the one extreme, you would have Machiavelli, who's just trying to whisper in the ear of the king, without caring for anything else, basically, than influencing the king. On the other extreme, you have the people who do policy analysis just to annoy the government. Like they do it to critique and to say why everything is bad. And you would have someone like Michel Foucault on the other end, who doesn't even have a plan of what to do. He's just like, I think things are suspicious, right? And then you just talk about how things are suspicious, but no real policy comes out of this. And there's a lot of in between. But for the remaining of this lecture, I want to basically split it into two big variants. The one that's more oriented towards advice, right? Not in the Machiavellian sense of like the evil sense, but just your job is to tell policymakers what to do. And those more oriented at critique. Of course, they can mingle. Policy advice can be critical and critique can come up with new plans. But for simplicity's sake, I'm going to divide it into two, also corresponding to different books I've read about different things. So here we have Stalin advising Lenin on what to do. Probably was a good advice. He was like, let's not make war. And Lenin was like, that's right. Stalin was a good advisor. It's only when he got the power it became problematic. So policy advice, right? Here I'm talking about policy advice in its written form. I'm not talking about whispering or being in the Oval Office with the president. I'm talking about briefings that policymakers get, or documents that help them make decisions, right? Now, policy advice is always oriented to advise active policy and active politicians. This is not reflective. This is not for the field as a whole. You're addressing it directly to policymakers. That could be open. Other people could read it. It could be secret. It's also possible. Mostly it's open, this type of things. And it tries to advise policymakers on the policy process as a whole. This is not just about the decision point where you decide what to do. This is also about, hey, if you're planning of looking at this, you should really start measuring these and these and these variables. Otherwise, you'll never figure out what to really do. Or it could be, if just a new problem comes up, something happens, right? Like COVID, for example. Talking about what the problem really is, right? It could be about the focus of the problem definition too. It can be quite early in the policy process. It's not just at the end when the big decisions are made. So that's what policy advice tries to do. Again, this could be both internal or external. Usually it's internal, right? Usually the president or minister or secretary ask for your advice. That's why you're there in the first place. And typically, it's not always internal in that case, but it could be internal, that it's somebody who simply works for the government. But policy advice could also come from the outside. An NGO could write about an issue that the government doesn't actually know that much about. Let's say migration, for example, legal migration. The government, by definition, doesn't know much about illegal migration. Why? Because it's illegal. If it would not be illegal, the government would handle it, right? So in that case, an NGO can compile policy advice. If they know that some kind of choice is coming up, they can do that. They can send it to the government, and then the government could read that and could take it into account. Well, not the government is a misleading term, because we're advising people, not like constructs, right? Policymakers, I should say, can take it into account. Now, what's the difference between advice and analysis? Policy advice is a more specific variant of policy analysis that takes politics into account. Policy analysis is, in its more pure form, it's just a technical study of what is the problem and what could be done, right? And what could be done regardless of what the policymakers think or want, right? It also includes utopic solutions, utopic in the sense of optimal solutions, right? However, policymakers don't deal with a reality in which they can always make optimal choices. So a lot of the choices that are at hand, although they're good choices, are going to be difficult for them. Now, policy advice is that type of policy analysis which takes the political context into account, which thinks along with the ruler, let's say. It knows that this ruler does not have these or that legal power, so it's not going to advise them to do something that they can't do anyway, right? Policy advice is going to take into account the limited resources or the political feasibility of it, how popular certain things are. Or that an election cycle is going to come up, right? Things like that. It doesn't just say in abstract what should do. It says what a ruler should do in his position as a ruler, right? In his current situation. That doesn't mean that it has politics as the objective, right? The policy advice is not oriented at making this ruler win the elections. It would be political advice, not policy advice. They're not spin doctors. They're not campaign managers. It just takes into account that this election will happen. Right? The point of policy advice is not to help this politician have more power, kind of like Machiavelli did. We're trying to solve this policy issue, knowing who you are, right? So it's policy analysis filtered through political constraints. We try to advise the policymaker in something that is actually useful for them right now. And that can mean eliminating certain options from it. For example, in my own work, if on robotization, The dry answer to stop robotization is not to have robots. It's a very unsurprising answer. That is how you would solve this problem. You will not have unemployment caused by robots if you just don't invest in robots. However, I already know that they're not going to listen to this. So I mention it in my writings, but I don't talk about it too much because I already know that this is not part of the policy advice. They're not going to do it. They also can't really do it on their own. Them, I mean, Nivelion as a state. So in the advisory part, you kind of skip over that, right? But in the analysis, honesty compels you to point out that the most obvious option is to do this. Now, the question with policy advice is always if it's going to work, right? Will people actually listen to you if you're a policy advisor or not? I read an interesting chapter of a guy that both was a minister and an advisor, like he climbed up the ranks till he got the power himself. So he knows both about for like 30 years in the United Kingdom. He both knows how it is to receive advice and to get it and to give it. And he identified a number of factors that determine if your policy advice is going to actually work, if it has a chance of affecting things, because that's what you want as a policy analyst, right? So it's interesting to talk a bit about these various factors that play into this. One of the obvious factors that predicts if, well, nothing predicts it, right? But so let me gather my thoughts, blah, 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 blah. Okay, what I want to say first is that ultimately this comes down to the calculations and also the will of policymakers. And regardless of what you advise them, they can do the opposite, often because other people are advising them too, right? But there are certain factors that help your case. One of them is that they actually asked for your advice. This is a very simple thing, but for two reasons. One, well, because they have an interest in listening in the first place, because they asked it to you. But also, if it comes from the outside, policymakers have to ask themselves, why is this coming to me? Why are they sending me this paper? Usually because they want something, right? If it's a very elaborate paper, that means money went into it. That means they have some kind of interest in this. So policy advice coming from outside groups has a bit more suspicion connected to it than if it was asked for. Right? Doesn't mean it doesn't work, but it is better if it is internal. Also, it has more chance of working, especially if it's on a controversial issue. If it's a side, it is very tempting as a policy analyst to try to just be descriptive and explain the different options. And you say you could do this, but you could also do that, or you could also do this. Who knows, right? Or you say, well, who's right? Everybody's right, right? And you kind of do that. However, that will usually not help because the policy maker is usually not a single person. It's usually a team of people, and they internally disagree. So if you give them this type of document, they will each think they're right because they will each take this side from your argument, right? That fits their narrative. Well, if you take a position, you say there's three options, but really the third one is the best, then they can either be for or against, which will structure the discussion. They're either going to accept your proposal or they're going to reject it, right? But they're not going to ignore it. So you at least have a half chance of getting impact because you provide a more clear discussion point and potentially one that would tip the balance in favor of what you're proposing. It also is more effective if it comes from an independent institution. That contradicts a bit my first point, right? But by independent, I mean that they don't directly work for the policymaker. It could still be the government, right? INAGI is a government organization under one single minister, right? They are semi-independent in that regard, or CONACYT, or one of these kind of semi-governmental organizations. Their advice, if they're an established organization that has some years on their calendar, that has done good work in the past. And that also comes with a lot at the same time, with certain volume, that makes their point with authority, right, will have more impact than, for example, a think tank of a political party who are explicitly biased, or an organization that is independent but is not really, like Mexicanos contra la Corrupción, which is direct is run by the same people as Vapor Mexico, coalition of the opposition. If they're going to give advice to the government, there's a low chance the government is even going to read what they're saying. Right? Also, some things I'm saying are obvious, but they can help to make you think or strategize. The amount of evidence in something. Not just the amount of evidence, but also how accepted the evidence is. On some issues, you have conflicting sets of evidence, right? You have conflicting rates, for example, of unemployment rates, or you have conflicting estimates of future economic growth or things like that. If your evidence that you're using is closer to the consensus, or you can prove that a large number of groups would agree with you, regardless of the quality of the evidence, that is better than if evidence is contested, right? If the president comes out and says, tengo otros datos, then that's a bit of a problem, because now you're no longer talking about interpretation. They can just reject what you're saying as a whole, because your evidence, not that it's wrong, it's just, it opens itself up to politics. Let me reformulate this differently. If evidence exists that is accepted, for example, if it comes from INEGI, if you use that, that is more likely to be convincing than if you come up with evidence from some outside force that might not be generally accepted. Right. Also, timing is important. There are times when policymakers are more likely to listen. There are basically 3 times. First is when they just get in office, because they have a lot of space to do things. They can use new ideas, and they also have less burdens on them, right? They have less problems that they have to deal with. So when they get into office, when they're almost out of office, they're also more likely to listen, because it matters less, and they're kind of trying to push out new ideas at the end. While in the middle, they usually already have an agenda and they're more occupied with doing what they planned to do in the first place. And the third moment is when a new issue arises, when there is a problem. For example, government interest in water policy might be low until there is some kind of crisis, right? Until there is a drought, or until the United States want more water from us, then suddenly this becomes relevant, right? My assistant, Felix, my previous assistant, he's gone now for a while. He did his thesis on the water policy between Mexico and United States, which was, by the way, a very boring topic. Very technical, very just much history. I was always like, oh my God, I have to read this thesis again of him. Until suddenly Trump started questioning the water agreement between Mexico and US. And everybody tried to have an opinion, but nobody actually understood what this agreement was, except me and him. So suddenly we were relevant because we actually understood what the agreement was and how it was, etc. Because the media framed it wrong. The media framed it as in that we needed to get out of this agreement. What they didn't understand is that this agreement was heavily biased towards Mexico. As in, this agreement was made during World War II, when the United States had no time and they couldn't afford any conflict with us. So they were like, yeah, whatever you want, we'll sign it. That's a relevant thing to know. And this very boring, totally irrelevant thesis suddenly became more relevant. He missed the step. He didn't write a paper about it. But just to illustrate that, there's a certain moment when issues become relevant, and that's when you want to be there. These are kind of the timing of it that influences it. And sadly enough, policy proposals that are easier to do will usually also be more accepted. If you ask for new taxes, then politicians will kind of instinctively swallow and be like, oh, no, I didn't hear that, because I don't want to do that. If you ask for more spending, they will also pretend they didn't hear you. And if you ask for legal changes, they will also not like it, because all these things require more effort on their part. Of course, the exceptions are if your policy advice is directly about taxes, right, or about spending or about the law, that's a different case. But if you're talking about, again, water management, and you propose a new tax, that will be harder to sell than others. Now, all these things, right, you're trying to influence the ruler, but you're not necessarily agreeing with him. You're not a yes man if you're a policy advisor, right? You'd be a very worthless policy advisor if you would just try to reinforce whatever the policymakers are thinking. The goal of policy advice is not to have them agree with you. The goal of them is making the right decision, right? So it can definitely include criticism, which we're going to turn to next. However, criticism from the inside, as an advisor, right, is necessary, but it would have to be delivered in a way that's going to be effective, which mainly depends on it being confidential. If you are the advisor to the president, or to the governor, and you want to tell him that he's doing the wrong thing, you should tell that to them, not to the media, because then it becomes a political issue, and then there is no more time for reflection, right? If you do it publicly, this now just becomes a political attack that they will have to defend against. So they're going to double down on their mistake and actually defend their mistake instead of thinking about how not to make it, right? So you don't want to push them in this position that instead of changing their bad decision, they're going to start defending it because you didn't deliver the message with confidence. You can, of course, make it public, but you should first try to do it confidential. And second, your critique should be clear. There's many critiques that academics make that are worded in very philosophical terms or very long, etc., that you cannot expect a policymaker to read, right? You can expect policymakers to read papers, but if those papers are A, going to tell them they're wrong, and B, are very hard to understand, then there's less chance they're going to spend the time in it. So especially critique should be formulated very clearly, more so than positive advice. I talk a lot. Are you still awake? I see two of you being awake.
Yeah.
Any questions so far?
No, for my part, everything's clear. Thanks.
Are there things that you think are missing from my discussion? Because I'm just trying to gather the
I miss one point.
Mm-hmm.
The second time that you said it's like good to advise policymakers.
Sorry, say it again.
The second time when you said it's better to advise policymakers. Because you first said that it was when the elections just
okay.
and then the second point I lost.
So at the beginning of their term is good, and near the end of the term, when most of their plans are carried out already, but they have this new election to worry about, they might want to come with new ideas for next time, right? Because they don't want to, if the public gonna ask them, so what are you gonna do? They want to have future promises to make to the electorate, right? To say that, well, wait, there is more if you vote for me. So that can help. And again, keeping in mind, by the way, policymakers are more people than politicians, right? Policymakers are also bureaucrats, are also non-electable people, are also people that are permanently there, right? Like the head of the Marines, for example, is not a politician, right? He was there before, and he probably will outlast AMLO too. So it's not just politicians that you're talking about. In this case, yes, but So that's policy advising. It's a very hard craft, right? I've worked a little bit in this function, well, twice. My PhD was policy advice towards a local government. Local means state level. Although it was very disconnected to it, as in we would meet with them and they would listen to us, or at least pretend to listen to us, but we were quite far away from any decision making in that. So this was quite at a distance. And the second time I worked for it was actually even at more distance. It was just commissioned government, but the feedback loop didn't work through. But it did work in the sense that you, how do you say that? It helped to get agreement amongst all the other actors. Anyway, so let's say I have more experience with policy analysis than advice. The time I was in this position, the advisory part was limited in that. I think if I would do it again, I would focus a lot more on trying to think along with the policymaker rather than trying to be critical, which is the other way you could do things. So this is policy analysis as critique, right? Now, this is not criticizing policy. This is not writing bad opinion pieces about some policy or something like that. That's not the goal, right? The goal is still to end up with better policy, not to trash the one making it, right? This is separate. This is still science. This is separate from generalized critique. But there is a space for that, right? Policy analysts, they don't just have to think along with whatever the politician is doing, because politician might be wrong. And they're not just there to assist them. They're not just there to, politician says, I have this problem, and you just deliver a solution to that problem. Because maybe, for example, you, the expert, don't agree with the problem in the first place, right? You think that this is not really the problem, so I'm not also really going to provide a solution to this. For example, I remember one research that my colleagues were involved in, where, what was this about again? Where the government wanted to know or wanted to, what they wanted was to avoid segregation at all costs. So they wanted migrants to mix in with locals. So they wanted the policymakers to devise a way to get, let's say, fully mixed neighborhoods, which, as the researchers point out, does not necessarily solve the problem, because that doesn't make people interact. That can also just lead to more conflict. So they kind of redefined the research question, right? Because it didn't fully agree with the statement of it. Anyway, researchers, policy analysts, can also incorporate critique in their work, and see their work not just as a way of advising power, but also as speaking truth to power. Also using their position to make an intervention, so to speak. But then again, what is critique here, right? We understand the word critique normally as arguing against something, saying you do bad, right? You're stupid. You're a murderer. Lopez Gatell, you should be ashamed of yourself. Like that we call that critique. But critique and critical thinking really is about making people reflect upon things. That's what critique really is. Critique are statements that make people rethink things. That's what critique is. So you're not trying to argue against the policymaker necessarily, right? You can critique him while advising him, and the other way around. If you're advising him, you can also go against the policymaker, right? You don't need to be advice doesn't need to be friendly, or it needs, you could often you want to prevent them from doing something wrong. Really, critique is about how people reflect about what is happening. Like a Marxist critique, Marx's point is not that capitalists are evil. Marx's point is to make you understand what capitalists do and what are the effects of capitalism, right? He wants us to show that under all social relations, the fundamental thing, what's happening in the world, is that exploitation leads to inequality, right? And once you understand that, you understand everything different. Real critique helps you see certain things, help you see alternatives, help you see hidden problems with something, etc. It is illuminating, right? It's not just adversal. That is critique in general, right? And policy advisors also use this. Now, let's say true critical analysis, or the most critical analysis, isn't even aimed at policymakers. It's not aimed necessarily at advising the prince, because maybe you don't think the prince will listen anyway. The most critical variants of this are aimed at the population at large, right? Marx was not saying, hey, king, capitalism is problematic. I suggest you switch to communism. He didn't write a letter to the king ever, right? He wrote to the people in the Communist Manifesto saying, hey, things are going to go horribly wrong. We must rise up. Let's go, right? So the most radical policy analysis or policy critique is actually aimed at civilians, at helping people understand what this policy does, what is happening, what are its effects going to be, and in particular, it would be directed, to quote Derek, at an audience of sufferers in order to make plain to them the cause of their suffering. It is the most critical, the most critical thing to do is making people understand why they are screwed, right? That could lead to protest, for example, that could lead to change. So this type of policy analysis isn't necessarily even aimed at any policymaker, unless you consider, of course, the people as a whole policymakers in a very radically democratic sense. I'm being invaded. Okay. It's a friendly invasion. Now, what can this be, right? What are these critical approaches to policy analysis? There's various things to do that go beyond weighing options, right? Because telling the policymaker they're wrong is not necessarily critique. It just means you have three options. This one is the cheapest, and you're not picking the cheapest. Why aren't you picking the cheapest? That's still policy advice, right? For critique, you need to illuminate something. One of the things that's common is to show bias in policies. Various policies are formulated in the general interest, but they're not actually so. Either by design, they're not so, because some elite interest group got them on the policy agenda, or they were well-intentioned, they just don't work out that way, right? And critical policy analysis can show people like, look, this policy is going to do this, but it's going to do something different for other people than you. Like, you're not going to be affected by this equally. A simple example of this is a tax cut. Trump's latest round of tax cuts, for example, disproportionately favored the wealthy 1%. It included things like the elimination of an estate tax, which is a tax on inheritances. If you just state that, very simply, you say, well, it's kind of crazy that when people die, they have to pay taxes. And the people go like, yeah, we don't want to pay taxes if we die. Except that 99% of people, 99.5% of people don't pay this tax anyway because they're not rich enough, right? So it's important to illuminate who this actually affects, right? And also to illuminate how they're going to recuperate that money, right? It's important to know if Ricardo Anaya, our friend, when he proposes universal basic income, I talked about this before, I think, this is a progressive policy. Sounds good, right? Everybody gets 3,000 pesos. What he doesn't say is that he is going to get this money by cutting everything else and basically just selling the state off, and you just get money, right? It's important that you say, okay, either there's two options. Either you're not going to get this amount of money, and what's realistic is 500 pesos per month, or you're going to get this amount, but then we have to cut, I don't know, half the educational budget. Yay. Right, critical policy analysis can do that. Or there are a lot of, okay, to go back to taxes. Have you ever heard of a flat tax? The idea of a flat tax? A flat tax is where everybody pays the same tax rate, which is a very easy thing to trick people with that are not critical. Because you say, well, you know, yeah, the rich and the poor, you know what? Why don't we just make it equal, right? For more equality, and everybody pays the same taxes. It's simple. You don't need to calculate nothing, right? It's just 10%, and that's it. Or even better, it's just the number, right? It's just you pay 20,000 pesos taxes a year, right? And no calculations, no bookies, nothing. This might sound persuasive, except that this enormously favors the rich, right? Because the poor are going to probably pay slightly more in a flat tax than they already do, because often they're tax exempt. And the rich are going to end up paying, I don't know, 0.5% of their money at the end of the day, because they earn so much more than the tax rate. So it's interesting to calculate what would be the effects of such a thing. Or well, there's various other examples that you could give. One that comes to mind of a strong bias in policy design was when Trump was, once upon a time, Trump was selling national parks. And he came with this very hard populist argument that, you know, nature belongs to the people, so we should give it back to them, right? I'm giving back the parks to the citizens of the United States, and they can all buy it. He did so. What happened is that the thing went on sale. Day one, the whole park got sold to a mining company that was going to mine it for uranium. So that afterwards, they figured out that they, of course, proposed the selling of this park. They tracked that they were lobbying Trump for months to say, hey, we think there's uranium on this park. Why don't you sell it? He was like, I can't sell parks. He said, say it's for the people or something, right? You're giving it back to the people. And then like nobody got a piece of it. Anyway, you know, policy analysis is pointing out these type of things, right? Policy critique, that your policy, you formulate in general interest, but it's not. Also, it could be a bit more subtle, talking about the concepts that are used in policy. Now we get more in the field of discourse analysis. You try to make explicit the meaning behind the policies, right? So how are you approaching the problem? What concepts do you use? Or are you, for example, you might have heard Hillary Clinton's famous moment when she talked about super predators when describing young black people, right? She tried to pass a law that would raise the bar of criminalization. I'm saying this wrong. My English is stumbling. She tried to raise sentences, prison sentences, right? People would go to prison more easy and longer. And the way that this policy was framed was fully focusing on gangs and was fully focusing on the aggressive part of gangs, right? While, of course, not all criminals are in gangs, right? Most thieves are just thieves on their own that stole something, but they're going to be judged by the same laws. So it's good to talk a bit more then about what do gangs mean, right? And how do gangs stack up versus general crime? So that is studying the concepts that policymakers use, or you know, if they talk about opportunities, well, what does it actually mean, right? Or for example, let me use some of my own examples. I studied poverty projects, right, in Belgium. And one of the things I start noticing is that whenever people start talking about empowerment, that's when they don't actually know what they're saying. It's a very consistent thing. Whenever you ask somebody, oh, what's your project doing for poor people, right? And they would say it empowers them. That would be when they didn't have actually an answer. You'd ask, okay, so what does that mean, right? Empowerment. Well, you know, that they get stronger. Okay, so what did you give them? Did you give them any, like give you them money? Did you give them tools? No, they just empowered them. Yeah, but how? And then again to, well, they felt better after talking to us. Okay, so you mean that you're talking to them? Yes. Okay, so empowerment means talking. Okay, that could be good, right? Talking, but I started noticing that whenever a project couldn't really justify what they were doing, or like they did something, but they couldn't say if it really worked, then they would talk about empowerment, because you cannot measure empowerment, so it's a safe thing to say, right? Everything could be empowering. Seeing a flower could be empowering because it inspires you. A compliment could be empowering. Learning from your mistakes could be empowering. But I would just ask them at the end, is there any person that participated in your project that was poor, that is not poor now? If they couldn't say decisively yes to that, I would just be like, scratch, fuck you, right? Your project, you're just trying to sell some, you're just trying to get money from the government. But that's discourse analysis too, right? Whenever certain words come up, what are they really trying to do with this? And also narrative analysis. Policymakers will often tell stories, usually the same story. And it's interesting to analyze, okay, where does this story come from? Is it representative or not, right? I remember in Belgium, sorry for my many Belgian examples, it's more objective when I talk about Belgium, right? Because I'm not connected to any, I am connected to a political party there too, but they're not in power. I remember once talking about migration policy. It was about migration policy and family care. It was about if we should give money to migrant families, right? And the minister tried to reduce the money. He wanted a two-way system where people who were, they call this, who are Belgian by blood would get more money than people who just got the nationality, right? And he came with this story every time about that there was a family that had so many children that the government paid them enough so they could buy a house after 3 years. And this went along for a year, him telling the story, until some journalist was like, but who is this family, right? And he was like, oh yeah, I heard about it. What do you mean you heard about it? Yeah, you know, they say that there's this family. But like, where is this family? In what municipality, right? So we can check. It was like, well, you know, it's not like this didn't actually happen. It's just that it could have happened, he said. So he's the whole time he's been telling a story that didn't even happen. But they were changing the policy based on this. It is critical to examine, you know, to what extent this is even real, the story you're telling, or if it's representative or not. And the use of, you know, labels, etc. For certain problems. Then you can also go a step further when studying the communication of politicians and be critical in the sense that you hold a certain standard by which you would test it, right? For example, if they lie or not is a very simple way of doing it, but that's not really policy analysis. It's more you would let's connect to what I just said, but you would try to assess to what extent their communication is sincere, right? Are they giving the full information on something? Are they obscuring certain things? Are they trying to confuse the people or not? So this is more on a just communicative level that you study it. An example of this is that policymakers will often, what they ideally want is to make it look like they had no choice. That would block a lot of critique, right? They say it's simply not possible to have done something else. Those assumptions of what is not possible themselves are political. They're often very ideological, right? Famous example of this is Margaret Thatcher with her phrase of that there's no alternative, which in very general sense is nonsense, because I know France was doing something completely different and France still exists today. So yes, there was an alternative. But they will try to make it look that way. One modern way of saying this is that the globalization forces you to, right? We couldn't do this because the markets, this and this and that. And then critical policy analysis will go to explaining why this is not true and that you could have done different things, right? So it's about showing how policymakers, through their discourse, often close off certain options. They kind of obscure alternatives to what they're doing to make the discussion look narrower than it really is. And critical policy analysis can help illuminate that. The last thing that critical policy analysis can do is to try to give voice to the voiceless. It's to try to incorporate those groups that were not consulted in the real policy process. So, for example, you would, if you'd have a social policies rarely consult the people that they're trying to help. And so they don't even know if this help is well received or how people feel about it. For example, if your social policy is to hand out food, so you subdirect it, you outsource it to some charity, right, that hands out food. Maybe people hate this. Maybe people find it very shameful to stand in line for food, right? And they much rather have it if the government would give them a tarjeta than just get money on it, right? Now this you will never know, because logistically the food handout thing will be superior, because you're using food waste and recycling things and you have NGOs involved, and you know it's a lot cheaper on the whole. But critical policy analysis would try to examine, okay, but who's affected by these policies, right? And not just directly affected by it, right? So for example, if you talk about the military, critical policy analysis could also consult, for example, the family of soldiers, right? And so the consequences of a war are bigger than what happens inside a war. They're also about whole communities who only have single parent families, right? Because the fathers are fighting somewhere, etc. So critical policy analysis can try to use participative methods to bring in certain voices, certain experiences that were not there initially in the policy process, right? So it could say, hey, either it takes the form of critique, as in you're not participatory enough, we talked about it last time, or it just tries to offer these other perspectives that kind of broaden the discussion. I'm talking too fast and I'm falling over my words. It's a good time to drink. Do you have any questions?
I don't think so. I think it was really clear.
Was I acting like Sheinbaum with my hands or what?
No, because that video is from one time that Sheinbaum was explaining how people criticize everything of the government, and she was like criticando.
Ah, okay,
So
okay.
It's a meme.
Okay. I sorry, I didn't know it. Any questions or remarks, Ms. Marianne or Sophia? Or you want to take a while more? All right. So last thing I want to talk about is kind of critique, which you also need to do. This critical mode, right? It became easier to do over time because you have less centralized power. So in a kind of network, right? You're not necessarily attacking any particular person. You just have more people that could potentially listen to you. But it is also proven over time that critical analysis can sometimes be very limited, in the sense that, especially with these more linguistic things, you can make everything look suspicious to the point of irrelevance, right? You could, for example, and people have done this, you could measure that AMLO almost never talks about transsexuals. You would analyze the Mañaneras and you would say he talked only once about transsexuals. Yeah, but he also doesn't deal with that topic, right? So this is not a very interesting conclusion. You can make everything look suspicious just by putting air quotes, right? If they say, oh, we're going to help the people, and then you're like, we're going to help the people, but that is very paternalistic, because you assume that they need money to live. What if they were more indigenous and they want to live off nature instead of you imposing your money economy on them by trying to help? You can make anything look suspicious if you just dig deep enough. And in a point that will start working disempowering. If everything's suspicious, then there's nothing we can do, right? You could describe reality so negative that people would just get depressed, and you would say, yeah, the government is evil and powerful, right? So I'm just gonna watch football then, I guess. Conspiracy theories often have this effect. They work disempowering. You make the enemy look so evil and that people are like, oh, yeah, everything's bad, but there's nothing we can do. For critique needs to eventually lead to action. So you have to also show still that things could be different, right? You can't just describe the problem or how evil a certain policy is. You have to show where and what could have been done different. You need to, at the end of the day, come to some kind of proposal again. Not necessarily that you need to then formulate the whole policy, but you need to show at least what could be done different, right? Not that the government is like, we are so bad. Ah, well, and then carry on. You need to come to some kind of constructive point. At least I believe that. I make a principle out of it, that whenever I critique things in writing, that I don't end on that. If you read any of my essays, I try to always end on some somewhat constructive note. Not to say that I have the answer, but at least I'm like, the answer is probably over there. Go ask other people, right? Because otherwise it just becomes part of the problem. But this sometimes doesn't happen. Sometimes policy critique gets stuck in itself. And because research, this is a very sociological thing, researchers just want to be critical because that's safe, right? At best, what I'm saying, my attack on you is not true. At worst, my attack on you is not true. But I'm not taking any risks when I'm critiquing. Well, if you ask somebody to formulate then a different policy, now I have to take risks, right? Now I have to start making ideological assumptions. Now I need to start predicting things. Now I need to start using discourse. And often you will find that these more deconstructionist schools of criticism, etc., they'll shy away from things. They just want to critique. And that is less compatible with the field of policy analysis. That is more compatible with the field of philosophy. And with that note, I do want to end it. Ms. Mariana, you've been looking very suspicious throughout this whole session with your mask on. Has the Taliban come to you?
Well, I agree in the critique of the critical analysis because I also experienced that everything, like you can see everything through a critical sense to the point that you get demotivated and you don't want to do anything about it, like you're just depressed. So yeah, like it's important to also think about the solutions of things and put limits on the.
Your mic cut off. Or
Yeah, I finished.
is it?
Yeah, to put limits on
Okay.
the.
Yeah, I'm talking, of course, I'm talking about this as a professional occupation, right? I'm not talking about you, like you cannot be, you know, talking about if you earn money by critiquing policy. I sometimes have problems with it if it just ends in everything suspicious. And because you if you get to actual debates, you're gonna lose them. I've seen this. I've been in panels where like they're all we all the panelists were very critical of the government, and then like somebody of the government is actually in the audience, like front row, you just didn't see, and then like, well, I'm Secretary of Social Affairs, and if you say everything we do is wrong, then what should we do? And then my colleagues were like, well, you know, we're just scientists. I was like, thank you for asking. Here are my 8 points that I want you to do. And I just started going through this list. And she didn't expect it. Like she thought I would have no answer to this question. And just like, oh, well. And then the audience all turned towards her. And she's like, well, yeah, I'll look into it. She kind of left the building. So you want to have a counter proposal if you're going to criticize. Otherwise, you're very easily countered by just asking, so what? It was a trap, though. I organized this event. It was the cards were stacked against this poor lady. What else do you want to discuss?
Doctor, but also like medios de comunicación. I forgot how it's in English. They also play a huge role here now, like for being critique, because right now you have too many information about things, even investigations and all that stuff, that it's kind of hard to distinguish what is true and what is not.
Yeah, and as a policy analyst, especially as an advisor, you're always fighting against this. You're fighting against the media because you're trying to make the policy, what you're trying to do, because again, you're not a spin doctor. You're not trying to help the politician at politics, right? You're trying to help the population with getting better policies. So one of the things you're trying to push a long-term solution, usually. You're trying to do what's best in the interest of the policy, not the policymaker, right? But that policymaker is constantly watching TV and hearing things on the news, and they might be very tempted to just react to solve a certain criticism, and so you have that problem that you're fighting. Is that what you're talking about, or you meant more as a citizen?
No, that's what I meant. Because like, of course, media could provide some good information, but also they provide attacks and bad critiques according to the government of what they think about the government. So maybe you, as a police maker, you will be like, I think this is good, this is working, but because the media doesn't like the government, it's going to be, no, this doesn't work, and it also leads to not good understanding of what the policy is about, because the media is just doing like saying things that are not correct.
Of course, in most cases, and we're not living in those times right now, but in general, the media is on the government side. Like if you say this across countries, across times, usually the government is smart enough to manipulate the media rather than the other way around. But in recent times, both in Mexico and US, right, under Trump, the media was very clearly against him, which also had a distorting effect to some part. And right now in Mexico, media is almost wholly against. So you get the distorted view. I want to talk briefly, thank you for your comments, all of you, about your next homework. I'm going to upload it today. The sad news is you're going to have to read some kind of book. It is, and you have to read it by Monday. Now the book is short, and you don't need to be too concerned with it. The book is about the phases of policy analysis. It's a very standard work by Eugene. Let's dude's name? It's not this book, but I know his name is in here somewhere. Right.
You scared me when you took that book.
No. Eugene Bardach. This is a guy who wrote a lot about policy analysis. He wrote a book, or better said, a long paper about the various steps of policy analysis. What I want you to do is have a look at that and make a synoptic table or something like that. Basically, I want you just to summarize the different phases. This is a very formalistic homework, right? So you have, let's say, squares of a roster in phase 1, and then what it is, right? Then phase 2, what it is, phase 3, where you would, spend about 50 words per page, per phase, explaining what it is. So it's kind of summary of you, summary for you of these different phases. So in reading the book, you can read through it quite fast, right? You don't need to read all the academic explanation of things. You just need to try to grasp the different steps. Besides that, we have to do this for bureaucratic reasons. It is somewhat relevant because we're going to use this model actually for your PIA too. For your PIA, you're going to structure your PIA according to these different steps. So you're going to have to read it anyway at some point. This is a very standard text that is used a lot in Mexico. You can probably Google the answer to my question. However, I can do the same thing, and I can see if you're literally copying this from the internet too. So that is not that handy. So I'm going to upload this text and the assignment for next class. I would like you to do that. Is there panic? Like you have 5 exams by Monday?
Actually, the opposite of that. Well, I think.
Okay.
I don't want to talk for my friends.
Okay. Good. Well, then that's a good time to do this. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to take this model next class and I'm going to apply it to my own research so you can see a bit in practice what that would mean, right? I don't even know if I qualify. Maybe I did things wrong. We'll have to see it then. It will be half the lecture. So we're going to go over it, but I'm going to use a consistent example for it. And then maybe I talk about methodology if I feel like there's enough time for that. So that's what's coming. Okay. Good. Take care.
Okay.
Dear students.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Have a nice day.
Yep.
Take care. Bye.